Now, there's something I don't think we talk about enough in real estate development, which is imposter syndrome. And I'm not talking about somebody who's never done anything, watched 3 YouTube videos, and tomorrow they're calling themselves a real estate mogul. I'm talking about people who are actually doing the work, but still don't feel like they belong, right? You bought the property, you put the deal together, you're talking to architects, you're meeting with lenders, you're working through zoning, right? You're raising money, you're dealing with contractors, you're solving problems. You're taking the risk. And somehow there's still this little voice in your head saying, yeah, but are you really a developer? Right. I know that feeling because I've dealt with it myself. I didn't go to school for real estate development. I didn't graduate with a master's degree in urban planning. I didn't spend 10 years working underneath some major developer learning the business. I didn't come from a development family. I started with single family properties, right? Fixing them up, learning how construction worked, learning how financing worked, making mistakes, figuring things out. And eventually I went from single family fix and flips to taking on approximately an $8.2 million ground up mixed use development. And I can tell you this with all honesty, right? The voice in your head doesn't automatically disappear just because the projects get bigger. Sometimes it actually gets louder. What's going on, folks? Eddy Carrington, mayor of Flux City. And today I want to talk directly to the people trying to become developers, especially the emerging developer, right? Because there's a psychological side of this business that I think gets overlooked. You can learn how to build a pro forma. You can learn construction terminology, all about debt and equity, right? You can learn about tax credits, zoning, but eventually you're going to walk into a room where you feel like everybody in here knows more than I do. And sometimes they do, right? That's the part people don't tell you. Sometimes you're not imagining it. You might actually be the least experienced person at the table. But here's what I've learned in my personal journey, right? Being the least experienced person in the room does not mean you don't belong in the room. That's a major, major difference. I never had a formal introduction to development, right? A lot of people are aware of this, but I was introduced to real estate development slash investing when I worked at the bank. And I had a lot of big three clientele who had real estate, and they looked at real estate as a side hustle, but more importantly, as a way for them to be able to comfortably retire when they decided to call it quits. And so they looked at real estate as their 5 to 9, right? And when I saw how they were working and actually making real money in real estate, it motivated me to try my hand in a similar format, right? Part time when I get off of work, using a majority of my own money, which at the time in the city of Detroit, you were able to do so, right? And that is really my introduction into real estate investing slash development. Now, with that said, I didn't have some formal introduction to real estate development where somebody sat down and said, hey, look, Eddie, this is how you become a developer, right? There wasn't a curriculum for me. There wasn't a roadmap. I studied business administration in college, but not real estate development. My early career was in banking and financial services. And my introduction to real estate was basically doing it, right? Buying houses, fixing houses, selling houses, learning from contractors, learning what things cost, learning what happens when things don't go according to plan, which happens more often than you realize. And eventually you start realizing that real estate development is really just a much larger version of solving problems. Except now there are more zeros, right? More people, more regulations, financing sources, attorneys, more consultants, drawings, meetings, right? And way more opportunities for something to go wrong. Trust me. But when I started stepping into larger development projects, I remember being around people who had credentials and experience that I didn't have: architects, engineers, experienced developers, institutional lenders, city officials, attorneys, construction professionals, right? People casually using acronyms that I had never heard before. And then you're sitting there thinking, should I know what that means, right? and then you have to make a decision, right? Do I pretend or do I ask, right? Do I be vulnerable and let them know that I don't know what the heck is going on? And one of the biggest lessons I've learned is ask, right? Open up. Make sure these folks that you're talking to are aware that you aren't familiar with certain aspects of the deal, the project. And you'd be surprised at the level of respect that comes with the fact that you're vulnerable and you are not here trying to pose like you actually know, the individuals around you and you surround yourself, hopefully get behind you and support you in a way that gets you to a point of becoming successful due to the fact that you are honest with them and you're honest with yourself by exposing to them that there is something that you don't know and you want to learn. Now, imposter syndrome can actually get worse as you level up, right? Here's the funny thing. You might think success eliminates imposter syndrome. Not necessarily, because every time you level up, you enter a new room, right? When you're doing your first house, you're nervous about the house. Then you do a few houses and suddenly you're a little bit more comfortable, right? Okay, I understand this. This is when you decide you want to develop a small multifamily building potentially. Right now, you're uncomfortable again. Then maybe it's mixed use. Now there's commercial leasing, right? Maybe there's structured financing. Maybe there are public incentives. Maybe there's environmental work. Maybe you're dealing with a general contractor instead of individual trades. Maybe you're building from the ground up. Suddenly, you're a beginner again. And that's something I want people to understand. Growth repeatedly turns experienced people back into beginners, right? That's not necessarily evidence that you're an imposter. It might actually be evidence that you're growing. And if you're consistently operating in rooms where you know everything, you may not be pushing yourself enough. Now, for me, one of the biggest jumps was the project I have on the east side called The Ribbon. And I went from doing single family real estate to eventually developing a roughly 21,000 square foot, 3-story mixed use building on the east side, right? 18 apartments, commercial space, elevator, fire suppression, structural steel, commercial tenants, public incentives, multiple financing structures, affordable housing requirements, architects, engineers, a general contractor, lenders, inspectors, city departments, community stakeholders, all of it, right? And the total development cost ended up being more than my whole portfolio prior to me getting to this point of developing this commercial property. So all of the houses that I had an opportunity to do would not equate up to this $8 million number, right? Think about that transition, right? You're not going from a $100,000 house to a $150,000 house. You're jumping into something where millions of dollars are moving around. And I'm supposed to be the developer. There were definitely moments where I thought, what the hell did I get myself into? I still think that to this day. But here's what's interesting, right? The project didn't require me to know everything. It required me to figure out what needed to happen next. That's different. Now, let's talk about the biggest misconception about developers, right? I think emerging developers sometimes imagine that experienced developers walk around knowing everything. They don't. Trust me. Development is way too complicated. Nobody knows everything. Your architect knows things you don't know. Your attorney knows things you don't know. Your engineer knows things you don't know, right? Your general contractor as well. Your lender knows things that you don't know. Your property manager knows things that you don't know. And hopefully you know some of the things that they don't know, right? That's why there's a development team. Your job as the developer isn't necessarily to be the smartest technical expert sitting at every table. Your job is to understand the vision, assemble the right people, understand enough to ask good questions, make decisions, manage risks, solve problems, keep everybody moving, and somehow get this thing across the finish line, right? That's development. And I think understanding that freed me from feeling like I needed to have every answer. Now, this is the most important point I need you to understand from this video. Not knowing something does not mean you don't belong. I want emerging developers to really hear that, right? You're sitting in a meeting and somebody mentions something you don't understand. Your brain immediately goes, see, you're not ready, right? No, that's not the case. Maybe you just don't know that thing yet, right? That's it. Write it down, ask the question, research it, call somebody, learn it, use ChatGPT, right? There are things I understand today that would have sounded like a foreign language to me years ago, right? And there are things today that I still don't know, right? That's never going to end. The goal isn't know everything. The goal is become extremely good at learning, because development will humble you, right? You can do 10 projects and number 11 will introduce you to a problem you've never seen in your entire life. Now, there is a difference between imposter syndrome and being unprepared, right? Sometimes you feel unprepared because you actually are unprepared, right? And we have to be honest about that. You shouldn't walk into an $8 million project knowing absolutely nothing and say, well, Flux City told me to believe in myself. It doesn't work like that, right? That's not what I'm saying. Confidence is not a substitute for competence. There is a difference between I'm learning, but I have a team and resources necessary to execute this, and I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing, but I'm sure it'll all work out, right? Those are not the same thing. Real estate development involves other people's money, people's homes, businesses, neighborhoods, public resources, safety, construction, long term financial obligations. You have a responsibility to prepare yourself. But here's the trap. Some people keep preparing forever, right? Another class, another book, another certification, another conference, another year. Meanwhile, somebody who knew less than them started the project. There eventually comes a point where education has to become execution. Here's another thing I struggled with early on. At what point do you get to call yourself a developer, right? After one project, 5, 10, right? Does somebody give you a certificate, right? Does the Real Estate Developer Association of America send you a letter? Congratulations, Eddie. You're an official developer, right? Probably not. I don't think so. I haven't received my letter yet. But if you're actually developing real estate, you're a real estate developer, right? You don't need to have a skyscraper built, right? You don't need $100 million under management. You don't need to have some fancy office downtown. Development exists at different scales. Maybe you're taking a vacant duplex and bringing it back online. Maybe you're converting a storefront. Maybe you're developing 4 apartments. Maybe you're building 20 houses. Maybe you're doing $100 million mixed use project, right? Those are obviously different levels of complexity, but don't let somebody else's scale make you ashamed of yours. Every developer started somewhere. Now, your first project doesn't have to prove anything, right? I think this is where social media messes with people's heads. You'll see somebody announce $50 million development coming to Detroit, right? And you're still trying to figure out how to buy your first vacant house. So now your project feels insignificant, right? It is not by any means, right? Your first project doesn't need to transform the city. It needs to teach you how to become a better developer. Maybe that means learning acquisition, maybe construction, maybe leasing, financing, community engagement, dealing with the city, maybe learning that the contractor who said something would take 2 weeks actually meant 6. Or maybe that contractor disappears on you and you have to go through the process of understanding how to replace that contractor and fill in the blanks of the money that you paid that contractor in the beginning to begin with, right? These lessons compound, right? The skills from the house follow you into the duplex. The skills from the duplex follow you into the apartment building. The apartment building prepares you for the mixed use project. The mixed use project prepares you for whatever comes next, right? You don't teleport from beginner to experienced developer, right? You stack experiences. When it comes to your team, build one that fills your gaps, right? One of the smartest things an emerging developer can do is stop trying to hide what they don't know. Instead, build around it. If construction isn't your strength, get strong construction people around you. If finance isn't your strength, find people who understand development finance. If you're weak on entitlements, work with an architect or a land use professional who understands the process. If you've never done a certain type of deal, find somebody who has, right? That isn't weakness. That's development. I would actually be more concerned about the developer who thinks they don't need anybody, because your ability to assemble talent is part of your skill set. And as your projects get larger, that becomes even more important. Now, what changed my mindset was that instead of being embarrassed that somebody might know more than me, I started appreciating it, right? If I'm sitting at a table and everybody knows less than me, we might have a problem, right? I want the architect to know more about architecture than I do, right? I want the engineer to know more about engineering than me. I want the attorney to understand the legal documents better than I do, right? That's why they're there, right? So walk into these rooms, listen, ask questions, take notes, and don't be afraid to say, can you explain that to me? You would be amazed how many other people sitting at the same table didn't understand it either, right? They were basically just afraid to ask. Another thing I've learned is that you don't always feel ready before the opportunity arrives, right? Sometimes the opportunity is what forces you to become ready, right? You see a property, you see an RFP, you see a building, you see a neighborhood need, you see a project and think, man, somebody should do something with that property. I'm born and raised in this community, and I remember going to that building back when Mr. Smith owned it 30 years ago, and now it's abandoned. And I would love for somebody to redevelop it back into something new, right? And then you eventually realize maybe that somebody is you, right? That doesn't mean recklessly jumping into something, right? That doesn't mean recklessly jumping into something, right? Do the feasibility, understand the numbers, understand the risk, build the team, figure out the financing, but don't automatically disqualify yourself because you've never done something at that scale before. Because there is a paradox here, right? If somebody has to give you experience before you're allowed to do your first project, how would anybody ever become a developer? At some point, every experienced developer did something they had never done before. With all that said, let me let you in on a little secret. Your fear may never completely disappear. I don't want to sit here and pretend I've reached some point where I walk into every room with complete confidence, right? I haven't. There are still projects I look at and think, can I really pull this one off, right? There are still people I meet whose resumes are ridiculous, right? There are still conversations where I'm learning. There are still many opportunities that intimidate me, but my relationship with that feeling has changed, right? Years ago, fear might have meant maybe I shouldn't do this. Today it means, okay, what do I need to learn, right? Who needs to be on the team and what needs to happen to make this possible, right? Same fear, different response. And that's growth. So if you're watching this right now and there's a property you've been driving past, a vacant building you've been researching, a project you've sketched out, an RFP you've thought about responding to, or an idea that feels slightly bigger than the version of yourself you currently believe you are, I want you to ask yourself something. What exactly is stopping me, right? Not emotionally, practically, right? Is it money, experience, knowledge, site control, financing, construction expertise, connections, credit, time? Figure out the actual constraint, because I'm not good enough isn't actionable, but I don't understand construction financing yet. That's actionable, right? I need an architect, actionable. I need somebody on my team who's completed this type of project, actionable. I need $200,000 of equity. That's actionable, right? Turn insecurity into a list of problems. Developers solve problems. Start solving them. But you become a developer simply by developing, right? I started with single family houses. I didn't have a real estate development degree. I didn't have some perfectly mapped out career path. I learned by doing, and eventually that path led me to be able to do a mixed use ground up development. And I'm still learning, right? That's probably the most important thing I can tell you. I'm not making this video from the perspective of somebody who has everything figured out. I'm making it from the perspective of somebody who has repeatedly found himself standing in front of something bigger than anything he's done before and decided to figure it out. So if you're waiting until you feel completely qualified, completely confident, completely knowledgeable, completely ready, you might be waiting forever, right? Prepare yourself, respect the process, build your team, know your numbers, ask questions, stay humble, but don't confuse humility with believing you don't belong, right? You don't have to know everything. You don't have to come from the right background, and you don't have to wait for somebody else to officially declare you a developer. At some point, you have to develop something. And maybe the project you've been afraid to pursue isn't proof that you're in over your head. Maybe it's your opportunity to grow into the developer capable of doing it. I'm Eddy Carrington. This is Flux City, and I'll see you guys in the next video.